You know, it's not the 1980s anymore, which means it's the 1980s forever. I'm Mike Dangerous, and this is Talking Shots.
So chief, it's the return of the blade. It's like shade getting paid into my silhouette fades. A mercenary.
Ultra-violent, ultra-aesthetic, and overtly good at being one of the must-play indie titles of the last decade, Hotline Miami is a modern classic. The story is a little complicated. Miami, Russia, drugs, meta-commentary. This game is the 1980s, and then some. The same way movies like American Psycho are commentaries on hyperviolence for film, Hotline Miami is the same for video games. I don't know what it is about the 80s that just immediately makes you think of debauchery and violence. Well, actually, it was all the fucking debauchery and violence. I live in Miami, and everywhere you go and everyone you talk to has some kind of history to tell regarding the cocaine trade in Miami. It was, and still is to an extent, everywhere. In the 80s, art definitely reflected this reality. Why is this relevant today in 2019? Or even in 2012 when this game came out? I mean, today we have the internet. I can see titties whenever I want. Well, for one, the 80s nostalgia is still very much alive and well, long after it should have died out. And that may very well be because the 80s, besides setting a new precedent in violence in our entertainment, also set a precedent in the way we consume our entertainment. The very way we consume everything. The reason vaporwave and 80s and 90s capitalist culture is still so prevalent goes beyond just the nostalgia. The 80s and 90s, aside from being a time of fear and violence, was a time of hope and excitement. Promises of the future were everywhere in pop culture. A future we're quite literally living in. Vaporwave is a calling for a future we were promised. Movies and games like this are more than just nostalgic pieces. The fact that they take place in the 80s is very deliberate. But how's the game though? Hotline Miami is a top-down shooter being known for being hard as shit. The story is even more difficult to piece together, and that has everything to do with Hotline Miami's non-linear VHS store manner of storytelling. The storytelling's so meta, it might as well be S-tier and Brawl. It very much pays homage to the violent romps of the 80s, even goes as far as to put you on the set of a movie. The story's wild, but it's damn good. Even outside of that, with all the answers and even more questions the game and its sequel has, it really is about the player and about his reaction or lack thereof to the violence. In the 80s and 90s, video games were often used as a scapegoat, often having the finger pointed at them for their violent content, which is why it's so fitting that this game was modeled after retro top-down shooters of that era. Speaking of stylistic cues, the music is A1. Easily one of the top 10 video game soundtracks in the last 10 years. What's so brilliant about the soundtrack is that it's not just synthwave for the sake of synthwave. In Hotline Miami, and even more so in the sequel Wrong Number, the music is clearly using 80s synth sounds, and yet it feels like it could have been released today. Again, I have a feeling this was intentional. I get the feeling the intent of this game was to make you feel like a kid in the 1990s, and this uber-violent game just came out that your mom won't let you play. A game with no morals, where deep down the idea is we all only want to destroy. A mid-90s parent's worst nightmare. It's so violent and yet so beautiful. We just want to keep playing. It's a game that understands what it means to keep players interested through game design alone. It doesn't need crazy spectacle or movie-like cutscenes to be interesting. It shows that all you need is simple game design and iconic theming to make people want to pick it up. That's not to say it's easy. You die almost as much as you kill in this game, and you get back to the violence as quickly as you die. This game wastes no time getting you back into the violence. There is no game over screen. The game ends when you've had enough. To an extent, this game inspired the third wave of 80s nostalgia, if you will. Not just from a superficial nostalgic position, but a thematic one. The themes and ideas of the 1980s are still relevant today. The game makes a point that the violence and futuristic hopes of 1980s Miami are still relevant today. We love the 80s. Not because we remember it. I mean, most of us in our 20s weren't even born yet. We love the 80s for what it represents. A time of hope and worst case scenarios. A time where World War III was a looming concern, but the futuristic year of 2019, was just a step away. So what do you guys think? I'm dropping my phone. Are you tired of the 80s nostalgia? Did you like Bandersnatch? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, favorite, and subscribe. Buy our shirts, nerds. Link in the description.